In the first part of this film, we were discussing the events leading up to the last round of the fight against AOCA in the Cyprus emergency of the late 1950s. Telling the story were Sir Kenneth Darling, who was then the Director of Operations on the island, Lord Caradon, who, as Sir Hugh Foote, was the Governor and Commander-in-Chief, and Sir John Prendergast, who was the Chief of Intelligence. At the end of the first part, General Darling had arrived in the island and taken over his role as Director of Operations and had made his preparations to achieve what he said was his principal aim, that was to penetrate the heart of AOCA and to destroy its leader, General Grivas. General Darling, how were the AOCA operations developing at this time?
By early November, the AOCA offensive reached its climax. There had been many acts of murder by shooting, mining, and of sabotage. And as a measure of the seriousness of these attacks, during this period from October to early November, 24 members of security forces and civilians had been killed. And that number included no less than 10 civilians. And of course there were many more wounded and injured.
So this had in fact already developed into a campaign of indiscriminate terrorism.
Absolutely. And it was noticeable that as we got a tighter grip on the situation, that AOCA's tactics changed. And they originally started on the electrically controlled mine, and then they switched to the pressure mine. And
the significance of that, presumably, being that with an electrically controlled mine they could select targets, but with a pressure mine, anybody, however innocent, who happened to tread on it, got killed or mutilated.
That was one thing, and of course the other thing was they didn't have to have anyone there to do the job, and therefore they were acting at arm's length from us and keeping out of it as much as they could. And this, from our angle, was a heartening development, albeit that it did mean that they were concentrating on the easiest target, the soft target, from their own point of view. Well, now, at the end of this period, or during this period, there was one other event which I think is worthy of mention, and this was the explosion by AOCA of a device in the NAFI canteen of the Royal Air Force Station airport at Nicosia. This killed 2 RAF men and wounded many others. And realizing, as I obviously did, the vulnerability of men, women and children in canteens to attacks of this sort, and the appalling consequences which could flow from the planting of explosive devices on airports, let alone in aircraft, I decided to take very definite action straight away. And that night, when the full results of this act of sabotage was brought to me, I decided that forthwith, and when I say forthwith, I mean literally forthwith, all Greek Cypriot employees in NAFI canteens would be dismissed, literally, tomorrow morning. Now this action had some very interesting consequences. The first one was that what was predictable was the reaction of some trade union leaders was entirely predictable. They seemed to be more bothered about people's jobs and the lives of men, women and children. What was unpredictable was the incredible response we received in England from the ordinary folk who volunteered literally in their thousands to come out to Cyprus, which at that time was meant to be a very dangerous place, where women and children shouldn't be at all, come out to Cyprus and fill the gap left by these dismissed employees. And this was very heartening from the point of view of ourselves, as you can well imagine. Another interesting sideline from this decision of mine was the message was not lost in other Greek Cypriot employees, and we employed many thousands of them in other walks, that their labour was not indispensable. And if they continued in this way, well, they were dismissed too. And I may say that we never had another whistle from them at all during the rest of the emergency. And I think it's fair to say that this decision had a very heartening effect on the morale of the employee, of ourselves, the security forces, and a correspondingly depressing one on AOCA.
Did you have any political reaction from the Greek Cypriot community, aside from the trade unions, about this?
Not really, no. There was some very low-level comment in Cyprus, as naturally there would be, but from no other angle was any comment made on the decision I'd been taking, which was, again, yet another example of the complete political support we had in Cyprus from Her Majesty's government in England.
Now, we are now well into November of 1958, and about this time your new Chief of Intelligence arrived.
Yes, indeed. November the 21st was a turning point, because but then the steam had gone right out of Grievous's offensive, and John Prendergast, I was delighted to see, he arrived. I had some correspondence from Julian Amery, who was then the Under Secretary of State at the War Office. He'd written to me saying that in England public opinion was solidly behind us. And in reply, I think this sums up the situation very fairly, I said this to him: in the military field we quite definitely have the initiative, and I'm doing everything I can not only to hold it but to increase it. My policy is quite simply that if Ioka wishes to fight me, as apparently they will do so on my terms. Secondly, that when they do fight me, I intend to so stack the cards in the favour of my soldiers that they will be bound to get the better of the exchange. I've made it quite clear to Ioka that we mean business, and we have plenty of evidence to show that they are very windy of my soldiers. Thus they resort to these bestial tactics of murdering unarmed civilians, and even putting bombs in the hands of girls, inviting them to throw them at us. I reckon that any movement which is forced to resort to such tactics must be in pretty poor shape. And that is what I said to Julian Amery. And so John arrived, and I must say I never welcomed anyone more heartily than this tall figure of John Prendergast when he arrived. And again, in the same letter, I said to Julian Amery, I shall not, however, be able to make any real headway until I get the intelligence machinery into gear. I'm glad to say that all the recommendations that I have made have now been met, and John was the last one, you might say. And I'm very confident that this intelligence organization will, within, say, a couple of months, prove very effective. And jumping on a bit, it was a lucky chance, but in fact that estimate of 2 months was correct almost to the day. Now my instructions to John were quite simply these. He was to weld the intelligence organization into one whole, and it was to be a single organization under his complete command. I would only deal with him and with no one else, and he was to be styled not the Director of Intelligence, which was the old title, but the Chief of Intelligence, to make it absolutely clear to everyone that he was lord and master of the whole intelligence machine. And I said to him that he was to fix his sights quite firmly on George Grievous, and he was not to be distracted from this prime task by the antics of all the small fry of Ioka. And I also said that if needs be, military operations would be subordinated to the needs of intelligence. And so there it was. He had arrived, and I made it quite clear to him that he had my complete support. And what I noticed very quickly indeed was there's a complete change in the product of the intelligence machine. Whereas before, when I was rather inclined to being told what had happened yesterday, I was now in the happy position of being told by John what was likely to happen tomorrow and the next day, which was absolutely marvellous in my angle.
Yeah, very important. Now, Sir John, when you arrived in Cyprus, you had your instructions from the Director of Operations. But what was your impression of the state of the intelligence community at the time in Cyprus?
Well, as you will have heard, my instructions from the Director of Operations were quite clear, crystal clear. I knew exactly where I stood. I knew exactly what I had to do. And if I may just go back a little bit to my immediate arrival, I was very impressed indeed by the warmth of the reception. It made me feel that one was needed and one was certainly going to get a fair wind. With the result that I was able to go into my office and see the men who are there, and the people who are there, with the feeling and the message that we were going to get complete backing from the Director of Operations, that I was his Chief of Intelligence, I was his Head of Intelligence, I was the man to whom he would refer on all intelligence matters, and everything would be channeled through me. I had found in Kenya, as I've said already, I was in Kenya during some part of Mau Mau, and it was always crystal clear to me that it was essential that there was one source of the end product of the intelligence machine. Now, one of the things which I noticed on arrival, after a matter of days for that matter, because if you have been steeped in intelligence, it doesn't need any great brain, quite frankly, to sense. You get a feel of whether or not the organization is running well. You get a feel of whether or not people are cooperating with one another and trusting one another. And we come to the big issue, I think, of trust. You've got to get an organization behind you in the intelligence field probably more than any, because it is an area, it is a field where you can be misled, and unless you have got the backing, and unless you yourself support the men who are working with you, then you can be sold down the river and you can run into difficulties. I want to say straight away that there might be a feeling that because of all that's been said, that there was no intelligence in Cyprus at this time. There was intelligence in Cyprus. There were also quite a number of extremely intelligent operators in that field. There were men who knew their job. The trouble was there was lack of coordination and there was a lack of trust. There were men who knew a lot, but they wouldn't impart it to others. I think a certain amount of this lack of trust was born of the fact that those who were well-trained intelligence officers, and as I say, there were a goodly number of them there, realized that the special branch, to which in fact they were operating, was penetrated by EOKA, the special branch of the Cyprus police. Now, one of the things, therefore, I had to turn my attention to immediately was to clean out the stable. The stable had got very mucky and dirty, and from that point of view, I had to do quite a lot in ensuring that there was a counterintelligence set up and, as I say, a clearing out of those who were letting us down. And in fact, this also meant that, to all intents and purposes, the Cyprus machine, the intelligence machine in Cyprus had to be taken out of the Cyprus police. And this I did do with, of course, the understanding and backing of General Darling as Director of Operations. Now, that in itself, needless to say, was not going to give us good new intelligence, but one of the main jobs then after that was to get a number of officers infiltrated or brought into the organization who would work at particular desks with particular targets to produce master papers telling us where our weaknesses were in our knowledge of EOKA and our knowledge certainly of the movements of grievous.
Now, it seems from what you say that the General put you in charge not only of intelligence in the sense of gathering, collating, disseminating information, but counterintelligence and security as well. Do you think it is wise and desirable that there should be one head of all intelligence and counterintelligence operations in a situation like this?
I personally think it's absolutely essential because, again, intelligence is intelligence. Unless it all finishes up on one desk and is coordinated by one machine and, in fact, is put over and interpreted. And the interpretation of intelligence is a very, very important aspect of the whole issue of intelligence. The putting it over is an essential element in whether or not it's going to be believed thereby and therefore acted upon. Now, unless you have knowledge of the whole intelligence machine, unless you are the recipient, not only of clean intelligence coming in which will help the security forces, but also intelligence coming in which will help you to ensure that your intelligence is clean. Because apart from anything else in the counterintelligence field, there is the question of false intelligence being filtered into you and being fed into you. And in fact, that was happening in Cyprus, there's no doubt about it. But one of the main things that I think that one had to do at the beginning was this business of cleaning the stable. But the other was to ensure that every member who was going to work in the organization had trust in me, in the knowledge that I had total trust in the Director of Operations and that he had trust in me. A number, in fact, did say that under these rather tight conditions they would prefer not to go because they had their allegiances, they had their little black books in which they had agents' names and this and that and the other. We were at a stage at one point, I'm afraid, initially where even agents' names and that kind of thing, they wouldn't be passed over. This is no way to run an intelligence railroad, and therefore that had to stop. But in the end, there is no doubt at all, I feel, that the men who are there gave me not only their allegiance, but their backing and certainly hard work. They put into it everything I asked them to, and I think in the end one was able to say this is a clean organization, and what should emerge from it, what does emerge from it, should be good, clean intelligence.
Well, this was obviously very important at this stage because, if I could come back to you for a moment, Hugh Carradine, at this stage, November, December 1958, the scene was changing. We were moving the emphasis from military operations to political action. Now, you were at this stage deeply involved in this at the United Nations and elsewhere. What was going on behind the scenes in the political world at this time?
Yes, well, I'd put it this way, that it was extremely important that both activities should take place at the same time. The military step-up of activities which we've heard described, and the pursuit of the political objectives. One without the other would have not been possible or effective. And so at this time, the initiative which was taken in the summer under what was called the Macmillan Plan was beginning to have its effect internationally. And the plan, we didn't go into it in detail, the plan was one for a considerable measure of autonomy for the Turks in their areas, their own towns, a considerable amount of autonomy for the Greeks in their towns and their areas, over a considerable period, leading to a stage when both Greeks and Turks, it was hoped, would be able to agree to an independent Cyprus. And that's the essence of it. It should not be enosis, the union of Cyprus with Greece. It should not be partition, which was what advocated by the Turks. It should be a united and independent Cyprus. This was the whole purpose of the operation, the plan. So the plan was put forward in the summer, violently opposed, as we've described. And then later in the year, it began to take its effect. And I wasn't at the United Nations. I had plenty to do in Nicosia, but I watched, as you can imagine, hour by hour, day by day. I used to receive a telegram every night, a personal telegram from New York to tell me how Sir Pearson Dixon, our representative at the United Nations, was doing. The Greek government had decided to get a resolution, if they could, condemning our whole policy. But bit by bit, day by day, he was able to tell me in the telegrams that he was gaining support. The people, they said, well, the British plan may not be perfect, but it does seem to be an honest attempt to find a reasonable answer to a terribly difficult, dangerous problem. And so one country after another decided they would back the resolution supported by the British. And the resolution supported by the Greek government was receiving much less support. All was then ready. I've often told the story of the dramatic moment when Sir Pearson Dixon went down that day to a certain victory in the General Assembly. All that was necessary was to take the vote of the committee of the whole, and get the confirmation by a similar vote of the plenary session of the Assembly. But as he went down that day, he said to himself, you know, victory is not enough. We need to have a success. And he wouldn't go into the Assembly where they were waiting to vote, where he had a certain victory waiting for him. He went upstairs and he called the foreign ministers of Greece and Turkey. And eventually they came, and after their earnest discussion together, the three men alone, the foreign ministers of both Greece and Turkey pledged their personal honor to work as rapidly as possible for a final settlement in Cyprus. I didn't go, the vote took place in the Assembly below. A new resolution was moved at the last moment. By an extraordinary feat of organization, at the last moment, a unanimous vote was achieved in favor of a new resolution. And Zolu and Averov set to work out a settlement in agreement. I'm not going to go into the subsequent story that I had plenty to worry about in Nicosia, particularly because in the period that I had been governor, no one had been hanged.
Although you had the power to...
Yes, the governor had to exercise the prerogative of the Queen as to whether you should grant mercy if there was any reason whatsoever. But if there was no reason whatsoever, it was your duty to give the order and to fix the date. And so I knew that with these two young men convicted of a terrible crime of shooting a so-called informer as he slept, whether they were to hang or not. And there was no argument, there was no reason. I signed the death warrants, fixed the date. I went to lie down because I knew the next day 2 British civilians would be killed in response. And it was after midnight when a call came through from London. The call came through from the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lennox Boyd, to say that both the foreign ministers of Greece and Turkey, the two who had agreed in New York to work in their own personal honor for a settlement, wondered whether anything could be done to prevent the hangings which would lead to a new outburst of bloodshed. And it was after midnight, but I called up the Commissioner of Police and I said, I'm coming down to Commissioner of Prisons. I said, I'm coming down to see you. And he said, it'll be all over in half an hour. I said, no, I'm coming down to stop it. So I went down that night to the prison and came back. We tore off the death warrants. And within 3 months of that time, we had a peace settlement, largely owing to the results of Zolu of Turkey, Averov of Greece. So I tell the story that it came up to that pitch of crisis. It would not have been possible to get to that stage if it hadn't been for the fact that we had a complete understanding together with the military and the intelligence and ourselves as to what we were trying to do.
What did your director of operations think when you suddenly prevented the execution of 2 Greek Cypriot murderers?
Well, I called him up early in the morning, and I was worried because I wondered what the British public would say. I wondered what the soldiers would say. They say, people are being killed. What do you mean by going down in the middle of the night and play acting and tearing up death warrants? And I didn't have full opportunity to tell him why I had done this. But I understand that immediately he got hold of his military commander and said, hold it. We must wait and hear what the truth of this matter is, which showed a remarkable understanding and trust between us. I asked Lennox Boyd if he would let me to say why it was. He went and got hold of Mr. Zolu and Mr. Avelos. Mr. Zolu said, no, he didn't think it should be announced. So I had to go through. But the fact is that we had sufficient understanding, even in a case of that kind, where bitter feelings might arise, of working together.
You must, at this stage, have been giving some kind of military support to Hugh Carradon's, Hugh Foot's political initiatives. What were you able to do that didn't sort of stir the whole pot?
Well, I think I should just first say that at this time, Grievous resorted to his well-known tactic of offering a truce. He'd done this many times in the past and always made use of the breathing space afforded by regrouping his troops and so on and so forth. And on this occasion, fortunately, we received the most explicit instructions from the Prime Minister as to what our attitude should be towards the truce. And quite bluntly, our instructions were that in no circumstances were we to parley with Grievous or any member of EOCA, that we were to continue to keep up the pressure on EOCA, but acting in as subtle a way as possible. And this was a tremendous directive received from no less a person than the Prime Minister as to how we should handle this very tricky situation. So what do we do in the military field at this time? It struck me that the best thing we could do would be to mount what I described as phantom operations. And let me say really briefly what the specifications of these operations were. The first specification was that we wanted to make it absolutely clear to Grievous that we would do exactly what we wanted to do in the field of security, and we did not need to seek his prior permission, which is a sort of situation he was trying to work himself into. And the second one was, naturally, the last thing we wanted to do was to rock the political boat at this very critical juncture. And therefore, we had to be very subtle in what we could do. And so what I decided to do was to mount phantom operations. And broadly speaking, what happened was, I first of all asked John Prendergast as to what areas in Cyprus really were by and large clear of EOCA activity. I then decided to mount in those areas what I call an old-style operation, not this sort of small patrol, but cordon the search business, with theoretically plenty of troops being employed, showing that we were going on doing what we wanted to do. But at the same time, I decided to employ extremely few men on the ground to avoid any possibility of there being any clashes, if indeed we did meet anyone. And so that's why I used the phrase phantom. And so these are the specifications, clear areas, determined to do what we want to do without any prior permission, and very few number of troops. And we mounted 2 operations, one in the Troodos area, the northern slopes of Troodos, at the middle of January, and the other one in the Panhandle towards the end of January. Brigadier Tony Reid, who was commander of the Island Reserve, ran these operations absolutely brilliantly. And in the panhandle operation, and of course we had previously told the authorities in England what we were doing. He held the deception that we had employed. The newspapers said we had deployed 2,000 to 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers there, and the director of operations has obviously gone absolutely off his head doing such a thing at this time. And villagers indeed even curfewed themselves without even a soldier in sight. And we managed to hold the deception for about 3 to 4 days, but we couldn't go on much longer. But I think they did achieve the object, in that the Ioka wondered what on earth we were up to. In fact, we were up to nothing. And we did not rock the political boat in any way. I might say that Hugh Foote and I had our photographs published in the local papers, and we were described as being the servants of violence who kept the pot boiling and so on. I mean, and in comparison, Grievous was, of course, an angelic figure, as you can imagine.
Yes. It wasn't only Grievous that you deceived, actually, I can tell you, General. I took part in those operations, and I didn't realize at the time that I was part of a master deception plan. So, John, were you able to give any special intelligence support at this time? Was there any difference in your targets or your methods?
No. I think having got the machinery of intelligence, I feel, in reasonable order, it continued to develop and continued to become, I hope, and I think, in fact, a better machine. But then we had to turn ourselves and our attentions to choosing targets and deciding along which lines and which routes we were going to go. We had quite a lot to do in the way of building up surveillance. Surveillance, I contend, in circumstances like these of terrorism. And you've got to try and straddle various things. You've got to try and straddle routes for supply of arms, supply of monies, and communications generally, normal contact. And the only way to do this, quite frankly, you can't expect to get much intelligence in that field. You've got to gain your own intelligence. You've got to garner it yourself. And surveillance is the way to do it. And one of the things I did step up, and I had an extremely good man who was very, very able in the field of surveillance, which I would say here and now I think contributed immensely to the supply of material to us and supply of good intelligence, because it was material which we came from what we saw ourselves. That is one of the things which I had to build up fairly quickly. Then the other was the recruitment of agents. This is very much more difficult than one may think. You just can't go out and pick up somebody from the street. You've got to, first of all, identify those who are in an area where they know what you want to know. Having done that, then you've got to see how you can get alongside them, or if you can't get alongside them, how you can get, recruit them if at all possible. And in fact, we were, again, I was lucky in having one man who knew his stuff extremely well. He'd lived on one of the Greek islands for a good number of years. He spoke perfect Greek. And he was a very tough customer to deal with from the point of view of the Chief of Intelligence, because he felt he was his own Chief of Intelligence. But the fact still is that he was also a very, very good man in recruitment. He knew exactly what intelligence was about, and this is extremely helpful in any intelligence organization, particularly, again, if you're dealing with terrorism. Identify what you want, identify those who can give it to you, and then try and recruit them. This, in fact, was done, and it did give us very, very, very good material indeed. But you also then got to ensure that the material provided by these people is securely passed. And I come here to a lesson that I learned myself, more in Cyprus than I did elsewhere, and that is, it's wasteful of time may be, but in the end, it's far better when you have a top-line agent to do your own debriefing, the head of intelligence. Maybe it sounds like a big man, but the fact still is that he should get down to it and do his own debriefing of the handler, the man who is actually running top-line agents, because then you can get into the mind of the agents the other side.
Hugh, one of the sort of byproducts of the whole intelligence operation was a series of accusations by people, especially ill-intentioned politicians in this country, that British troops and security forces were engaged in rough methods, in torturing during interrogation. Did you come across any of that?
Oh yes, but of course it is a standard practice of a terrorist organization to make such accusations. But we thought, and scarcely needs explanation, we thought it was extremely important for the future and for every other point of view that there should be no such accusation justified. And I remember particularly when General Darling had recently arrived, and an officer of well-known regiments came in to me late one night and said that in a certain village not so very far away, torture was taking place under interrogation. And I called up the general and I said, let's go. He said, certainly, and we got an armoured car and we went out to the village, walked through the cordon and up to the place where the interrogation was taking place. And we could see nothing that was wrong. There was no indication of anything in the way of cruelty or bad treatment. We saw those down below in a stable, I remember, who, having gone through their interrogation, we had nothing to complain about. But the next morning, I may say, that it was known throughout the island, I think, by all concerned, where we'd been and why. I think this gave a better indication of our joint intention in this matter than any amount of circulars would have done. And I believe that when we came out at the end with good relationships, yes, good relationships with the Greeks and the Turks, it was largely due to the fact that there was every effort made anyhow to ensure that there was no bad treatment, no cruelty on our part in this dangerous situation.
Yes. Now, General Darling, the great figure in all this, General George Grievous, is still apparently at large, in spite of all these operations. Did you ever really come close to catching him?
Well, indeed, I don't know whether I did. John laid the foundation stones. And this is an interesting story, and I think one starts already with the London Conference. That occurred, finished on the 19th of February. And Grievous himself hadn't been invited to it. And indeed, he is rather in the dark as to what indeed had been agreed in London. And he didn't like this one little bit. He was at the same time under considerable pressure from the Greek government and from Macarius to really support the agreement which had been arrived at. And I may say that I've been in very close touch with John Prendergast during this period and before it, and he had told me how we were edging closer and closer to Grievous's whereabouts on almost a daily basis, which is very encouraging. And it was against this sort of background of Grievous's dissatisfaction with what was going on in London and had been agreed there, that he received at the conclusion of that conference some communication with the Greek government through official channels that for what the Greek government representatives had been told in London by the governor and by British ministers, that we knew where Grievous's lair was. Now, Grievous interpreted this message as being really almost a threat or blackmail on him, that unless he subscribed to the London Agreement forthwith, he would be arrested. And he argued in his own mind that no one except his own very close circle were privy to where he was. And he, in fact, didn't believe that what he'd been told was true. And moreover, he also argued that indeed if the British and the hated Director of Operations knew where he was lying up, that he was quite certain that we couldn't possibly resist the triumph of closing in on him and capturing him after a fruitless search for him, which had lasted the best part of 4 years. And so he thought the whole thing was bluff. Well, now, we, the British, we most certainly were not bluffing. And so the truth of the matter, which really has never been told before, was this. Shortly before the start of the London Conference, Hugh had gone home to attend it, and the preliminaries of it, of course. John Prendergast came to me one night, and he said to me, we have located Grievous in his lair in Nicosia with some of his closest associates, and we have him under very tight surveillance. This was, of course, thrilling news, because this is exactly what we had set out to achieve, and by Jove, with his help, we had done it. It was terrific, and one really was elated. And some people have said to me, well, when you knew where he was, why on earth didn't you get hold of your SATS teams, which had been trained for exactly this contingency, wade in and secure Grievous? Well, now, I was quite clear in my mind that the life of a single member of my security forces was far more valuable than the life of Grievous. And therefore, it was certain that if we did wade in, Grievous would not be taken alive. And it really was out of the question for me to do what might be called a Nelson act and put the telescope in my blind eye and get on with the job on my own initiative. And so that evening, a meeting was held by George Sinclair, who was the deputy governor, who was acting governor in Hugh's absence in England. A meeting was held between the three of us, John and myself and George, to decide what to do. And it was decided that the only thing to do was to send John home literally that night by air, by the evening plane, to report to the governor and the British ministers in London and to seek their decision as to what they wanted us to do. Did they want Grievous's head on a charger, or did they want us to allow him to stew in his own juice? It was as simple as that. And John went home, and he returned a day or so later to say that we would adopt the latter course. Grievous was to be allowed to stew in his own juice. And so that, so far as I was concerned, was the end of the emergency. The curtain came down. There's nothing more we could do. We had Ioka by the throat. We'd run the organisation into the ground, and we had its legendary leader literally in our grasp.
There's one nice story which I've often heard about Grievous's eventual departure when the emergency was over, to do with a guards officer. Is this story an authentic one, or?
Oh yes, indeed. I mean, Hugh Foot returned from London very shortly afterwards and set in train all the agreements arrived at in London, and the question of Grievous's removal from Cyprus, on which Her Majesty's government were insistent, had to be considered. And I really could not bring myself to bear to engage in some sort of charade with all the local Greek Cypriots as to this business of how he was going to emerge from his secret lair and all that business. So I went home on holiday to my own home in Chesterton, in England, as it happens, and left the matter to be handled by my very able Chief of Staff, Brigadier Paul Gladell. And I think the governor, in fact, thought that he should be seen off by some military man, but of not too high a rank, not to make too much of it. And we thought that undoubtedly Grievous would try to strike a bit of an act when he left. So, on the appointed day was St. Patrick's Day, as it happens, 17th of March. He emerged from his lair, went very quietly to Nixair Airport, accompanied by Macarius, and we had chosen, as a sort of the military presence, a certain Lieutenant Colonel Bill Gore-Langton of Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards, who'd been my GSO-1 operation. Yes. And he was a brilliant choice by Paul Goodell because he stood all of 6'4". There he would stand glaring down on Grievous, but twice his height. He would be immaculately turned out, unarmed, of course. But his strongest point was he had no right arm, having lost it in the war. And so he couldn't possibly salute Grievous, and Grievous couldn't possibly take offence if he didn't.
Brilliant.
And so, in fact, Grievous went off quite quietly in a Greek Air Force aircraft. He arrived at Athens, where he received a terrific hero's welcome, bands, crowds, and everything else, promoted to Lieutenant General, much higher than me, as a matter of fact, I may say, and was given some high Greek honour. And that really was Grievous's exit from Cyprus.
Well, now I think we really ought to try and draw some lessons from this whole fascinating story. Before I ask you, General, to talk about the military lessons, Hugh Carradine, have you got one single lapidary phrase that would sum up the political lessons?
Well, there are a great many lessons and a lot of political lessons about the necessity to search for a political solution and not to be preoccupied solely with military purposes, and that's when we were all in agreement with that. But the outstanding recollection in my mind is the extremely close and understanding cooperation which existed day by day, literally day by day, between myself and the military and the intelligence. We worked together on a basis of personal trust and respect. And the other factor, which is I like to remember, is I was talking to a young officer who used to be my ADC in those days, and I said I was going to come to this meeting, and he told me that it was Ken Darling who brought a spirit to all the soldiers of inspiration at a time when everyone was a bit confused and uncertain and unhappy. And so I think those are two factors. One, the closeness of cooperation, and two, the capacity to inspire his troops with a feeling that they were doing a first-rate job in a first-rate way.
So, John, what single lesson did you draw from this campaign?
Well, I think that the lesson I learned there was one which I had learned already, in fact, but it was reinforced by what I saw when I arrived, and that was one intelligence organization channeling through one source to one desk and one man reporting to the Director of Operations. And, if I may just add, a second point, I would call on all Director of Operations to support their intelligence organization, particularly their head of intelligence, and to trust him. If not, sack him.
Right, General Darling, the main military lessons of the Cyprus campaign.
Well, they're so important. In fact, I've jotted them down. I think looking back on the final round, no new lessons were learnt. I think one or two old ones were relearned. But the first one, I think, is this, that political violence, which has substantial popular support, can rarely be defeated by military means alone. It has to be countered and outmaneuvered on the political plane. The military function is to contain, at least, and if possible to reduce that violence. That's the first one. The second one is the importance of the political initiative running in the very closest concert with military measures. To achieve this, I don't think there's any better alternative than to having, as there was, a single commander of all the security forces established close to the top political leader, Huford, and in his full and constant confidence. And thirdly, the maintenance of morale and the correct reflection of the work of the security forces, both locally and abroad, I think were of prime importance. To achieve this, two aspects were successfully pursued. The first was consistency in aim and purpose. Confusion and lack of confidence so easily results if operations are turned on and off like a tap, or if all concerned are not clearly informed of what was required and what was being achieved. And secondly, the press, correctly and trustingly handled, was a very powerful element in my armoury. Fourthly, the civil indigenous police always become a priority target for terrorists. No effort must be spared to ensure that their capability and efficiency are not impaired, because if they are, the burden carried by the security forces is greatly increased. And then lastly, of course, and most importantly, is the setting up of a highly expert and centrally directed intelligence organization was the key to success, and enabled plans to be made to forestall events rather than to tackle their effects. Now, without such an organization, operations must inevitably be expensive in manpower and in time. They are cumbersome and they risk the alienation of the local population. But with it, selective targets by small bodies of highly trained troops can be directed on targets, such as the leadership, where it hurts most.
Now, as they say in Desert Island Discs, if you could have one of those, which would you regard as the most important lesson that you learned and the most important ingredient for the success of the Cyprus operation?
Oh, without doubt, the last, the intelligence. And thanks to John Prendergast, he gave me a weapon in my hand to use, which was as sharp as a rapier. That is the single most important lesson, I'm quite certain.